The Arizona Territory harbored many secrets in the turbulent years following the Civil War. Lost gold mines, forgotten trails, and men who'd rather leave their past buried beneath the scorching desert sun. But perhaps no secret was more intriguing than the true identity of the man folks simply called the Hermit of Shadow Creek, a quiet soul who appeared one day in the summer of 1875, purchasing an abandoned homestead in the remote reaches of the Superstition Mountains. Most folks in the nearby town of Redemption's Cross paid him little mind, just another lonely soul seeking solitude in the vastness of the American West. That was until the day the Clayton gang decided to make him their entertainment unknowingly, stirring a ghost that should have remained at rest. Join me today as we uncover the story of how 6 brutal outlaws learned too late that some men aren't what they seem, and some legends are better left undisturbed. If this tale sends a chill down your spine, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story might just stop your heart altogether. Now let me take you back to Redemption's Cross, Arizona Territory, where our story begins. The summer of 1875 was particularly merciless, even by Arizona standards. The kind of heat that made men question their sanity, and the very ground seemed to ripple like waves on a pond. It was on one such blistering afternoon that Margaret Wheeler, owner of the general store, first laid eyes on the man who would later become known as the Hermit. He arrived leading a pack mule loaded with supplies, his dark canvas duster coated with the red dust of the trail. Those who witnessed his arrival would later recall 2 things: the peculiar way he carried himself, straight-backed yet somehow fluid, like a cougar ready to spring, and the fact that he barely spoke above a whisper when asking directions to the land office. Sheriff Tom Hawley, 20 years on the job and weathered as old leather, watched the newcomer from his usual spot on the jailhouse porch. Later that evening, over whiskey with Doc Morrison, he would share his observations. 2 kinds of men wear their guns that way, Doc, soldiers and killers, and that man ain't got the bearing of any soldier I ever met. The Hermit, as he would come to be known, purchased the old Matthews place, 500 acres of rough country tucked away in a hidden valley where Shadow Creek cut through the mountains. The previous owner had vanished 3 years prior, leaving behind half-built dreams and a reputation for gold fever. The Hermit paid in gold eagles, sound and heavy, each coin inspected carefully by Franklin Pierce, the bank manager who'd served in the Treasury Department during the war and could spot a counterfeit by touch alone. Curious thing, Pierce would later tell his wife, each coin dated 1868, mint fresh, like they'd been stored away all these years. Makes you wonder what else he's got stored away. The man settled into his new property with methodical precision, working from dawn until dusk, rebuilding the cabin, clearing fields, and making improvements that spoke of someone planning to stay. He came to town only when necessary, buying supplies from Margaret Wheeler's store, always paying in exact change, never lingering longer than needed. His voice, when he used it at all, carried the soft rasp of someone unused to speaking. Doc Morrison was the first to actually engage with the mysterious newcomer, treating a gash on his arm from what the man claimed was a mishap while clearing brush. The doctor couldn't help but notice other marks beneath the torn sleeve, old scars that spoke of a violent history. Bullet wounds, knife marks, the kind of tales written in flesh that no simple hermit should have to tell. The summer weeks drifted by, hot and lazy, and the town might have forgotten about their peculiar neighbor entirely if not for the arrival of the Clayton gang. 6 men with hard eyes and cruel reputations, fresh from a string of robberies in New Mexico territory. They rode into Redemption's Cross like they owned it, their very presence changing the air, making it thick with the promise of violence to come. Little did they know, their decision to stop in this dusty corner of Arizona would set in motion events that would become whispered about in saloons across the territory. For they were about to learn what many had discovered too late. that sometimes the deadliest predators are the ones who choose to live quietly, away from the eyes of men. But that's getting ahead of our story. First, we need to understand just what kind of men the Claytons were, and why their arrival would shatter the peace of not just Redemption's Cross, but the life of a man who had hoped to leave violence behind him forever. The Clayton gang's reputation preceded them like thunder before a storm. Led by the eldest brother, Marcus Clayton, they'd carved a bloody path across 3 territories, leaving a trail of robbed banks, looted stagecoaches, and grieving widows. Marcus was the thinker, the planner, a man who'd learned strategy during the war and turned those skills to darker purposes. His brother Luke was the killer, quick with a gun and quicker to use it, while the youngest, James, had a taste for cruelty that made even hardened men uncomfortable. The other 3, Hank Pollard, Mexican Joe Vega, and a snake-eyed man known only as Collins, were chosen more for their brutality than their brains. They rode into Redemption's Cross on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when the heat made everyone move slow and think slower. Margaret Wheeler was helping young Tommy Barnes load supplies into his father's wagon when she heard the horses. 6 riders, dust-covered and dangerous, their spurs singing against the wooden sidewalk as they dismounted. Luke Clayton's eyes lingered on her a moment too long, making her skin crawl beneath her cotton dress. "Ma'am," he tipped his hat with mock politeness, "mighty fine establishment you got here." Inside the store, Marcus Clayton ran his finger along the shelves, sampling goods like a man shopping for dinner rather than casing a potential target. "Quiet town you got," he remarked casually, his voice carrying the soft drawl of East Texas. "Peaceful like. Sheriff, keep it that way?" "Sheriff Hawley does his job," Margaret replied carefully, hearing the threat beneath the question. "Good to hear," Marcus smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Shame how some towns have accidents, ain't it? Fires, robberies, all manner of misfortune." The message was clear. Protection money would be expected, and soon. That evening, the saloon became their headquarters. James Clayton, drunk on whiskey and his own meanness, started talking about their recent adventures. He was particularly proud of how they'd handled a stubborn banker in Las Cruces who'd tried to be heroic. "Shouldn't have made us drag his daughter." "Into it," James laughed, not noticing how even the hardened regulars at the bar drew back from his glee. Of course, by the end, he was real cooperative. Sheriff Hawley, watching from his office across the street, knew trouble when he saw it. He'd sent a telegram to the territorial marshal in Tucson, but help, if it came at all, would be days away. His deputy, young Billy Ward, fingered his badge nervously. "Maybe they'll move on," Billy suggested, more hope than conviction in his voice. "No." Hawley shook his head. "They're sizing us up, picking their moment. Question is, what are they really after?" The answer came sooner than expected. Mexican Joe and Collins, riding the outskirts of town, came across Tommy Barnes heading home. The boy's father had sent him to deliver supplies to the Hermit's place, a regular arrangement they'd worked out over the summer. "Well, what you got there, boy?" Collins reined his horse alongside the wagon, his voice friendly but his eyes cold. As stone, Tommy, raised to be respectful but not foolish, kept his distance. "Just supplies for Mr. Matthews' old place, the Hermit up Shadow Creek way." Mexican Joe's interest sharpened. "Hermit, eh? Lives all alone up there?" "Yes, sir." Keeps to himself mostly. The 2 outlaws exchanged glances that made Tommy's blood run cold. They let him pass, but the boy pushed his horses harder than usual, feeling their eyes on his back all the way down the road. Back in town, Marcus Clayton received this information with peculiar interest. "Hermit, you say? Man living alone way. Up in the mountains?" A slow smile spread across his face. "Boys, I believe we just found ourselves some entertainment." Tommy Barnes didn't sleep that night, the cold look in Collins's eyes haunting his dreams. At dawn, he saddled his father's fastest horse and rode out to Shadow Creek, taking the back trails to avoid the Clayton gang. He found the Hermit mending. Evinces, his movements precise and economical, no motion wasted. "Sir," Tommy called out, keeping his distance as the man had always preferred. "Thought you should know. There's trouble in town. Bad men asking about you." The hermit straightened slowly, and for a moment Tommy caught something in his eyes. Not fear, but a cold calculation that seemed to drop the temperature of the scorching morning air. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, yet somehow carried clearly across the distance. "You're a good lad, Tommy. Best stay away from the creek for a few days." Back in Redemption's Cross, the Clayton gang was making their presence felt. Luke Clayton had already started a fight at the saloon, beating a ranch hand senseless for the crime of looking at him wrong. Marcus was methodically visiting each business, explaining his terms for protection with the same casual manner he might discuss the weather. Sheriff Hawley found Margaret Wheeler at her store, taking inventory with trembling hands. "They took half my monthly earnings," she said quietly. "Said it was a down payment on future security." "They've hit every store on the street," Hawley replied, his weathered face tight with suppressed rage. "I sent more telegrams, but—" He didn't need to finish. They both knew help wasn't coming soon enough. That afternoon, James Clayton and Mexican Joe rode out toward Shadow Creek, liquored up and looking for sport. They found the hermit's cabin easily enough, following Tommy's wagon tracks. The place was neat, well-maintained, with a small garden and a corral holding 2 horses. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the heat. "Well, ain't this cozy?" James drawled, dismounting. "Regular little paradise up here." The hermit emerged from his cabin, moving with that peculiar fluid grace that some might have recognized as the movement of a predator. He stood on his porch, saying nothing, waiting. "Friend," James called out, his hand resting casually near his gun. "My brother Marcus sends his regards. Says you ought to know about our protection services, being all alone up here." The hermit remained silent, but something in his stillness made Mexican Joe's horse stamp nervously. "Ain't polite to ignore a friendly offer," James continued, his voice taking on an edge. "Why don't you come down here so we can discuss terms?" "Leave." The word was barely a whisper, yet it carried the finality of a coffin lid closing. "James." Clayton wasn't used to being denied. His hand dropped to his gun, but before he could clear leather, something in the hermit's stance made him pause. Later, he would tell his brother it was like staring at a rattler, knowing the strike was coming. But not when. 2 days, James managed, covering his unease with bravado. "That's how long you got to reconsider. After that, well..." He let the threat hang in the air. The hermit had already turned away, dismissing them as if they were no more concerning than the desert wind. As they rode back to town, Mexican Joe crossed himself, an old habit from his childhood. "There's something wrong about that hombre, James. The way he stood, the way he moved." "He's just some old hermit," James spat, but his voice lacked conviction. 2 days from now, we'll teach him what happens to folks who don't show proper respect." Neither man noticed the hermit watching them leave, his eyes cold as a winter moon, nor did they see him enter his cabin and move aside the old bearskin rug, revealing a trapdoor beneath. In the hidden cellar lay the answers to who he really was, and why some men are best left to their solitude. In the hidden cellar beneath the cabin floor, the hermit stood motionless, staring at a wooden chest he hadn't opened in 3 years. The lantern light caught the scars on his hands as he finally lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay the remnants of another life. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age, wanted posters bearing faces long since dead, and beneath them all, a matched pair of Colt peacemakers, their ivory grips worn smooth by years of use. He lifted one gun, feeling its familiar weight. The silver finish had been deliberately dulled to prevent glare, and the customized trigger assembly was smoother than factory work. These weren't just weapons. They were extensions of the man he'd once been, the man he'd tried to bury in this quiet valley. Above, the desert wind moaned through the canyon like lost souls seeking rest. In town, Marcus Clayton was hearing his brother's report with growing interest. "Silent type, you say?" He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "And the way he moved bothered you?" James shifted uncomfortably, the memory still fresh. "Like a big cat, Marcus. Still as death one moment, then." He took another drink of whiskey. "Something ain't natural about it." Marcus turned to Collins, who'd been quietly listening. "What do you make of it?" Collins had survived 20 years of frontier violence by trusting his instincts. "Reminds me of something I saw once down Texas way. Man called Santiago had that same kind of movement. Turned out he'd been one of them Mexican guerrilla fighters." "This ain't no Mexican," Mexican Joe interrupted. "But he's got that same look, like he's seeing things before they happen." Marcus absorbed this information carefully. Unlike his brothers, he believed in gathering intelligence before acting. "Doc," he called to the saloon keeper, "tell me about this Hermit. When'd he show up?" Doc Tillman, trapped behind his own bar by the outlaw's presence, wiped his hands nervously on his apron. 3, maybe 4 months back. Keeps to himself, pays in gold, never causes trouble." "Gold, you say?" "Luke." Clayton perked up. "Where's he get that?" "Probably got a mine up there," James suggested. "All them mountains bound to be gold somewhere." But Marcus wasn't convinced. Something about this situation nagged at him like a bad tooth. "Sheriff still in town?" "Rode out this morning," Collins reported. "Him and that green deputy heading toward Tucson. Probably looking for help." Marcus smiled coldly. "Won't find it in time. Luke, take Joe and watch the trails. I want to know if our law-abiding friend comes back early." He turned to James. "You and Collins ride up to the Hermit's place again. Don't start anything, just watch. I want to know his routine, where he goes, what he does." "What about you?" Luke asked. "I'm going to send a few telegrams." "Man living alone, paying in gold, moving like a fighter." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Might be worth knowing if anyone matching his description is wanted somewhere." As the brothers dispersed to their tasks, Margaret Wheeler was making her own preparations. She'd seen enough violence in her life to recognize its approach. The shotgun under her store counter was loaded with fresh shells, and she'd sent word to the outlying ranches, warning them to stay clear of town. But it was Doc Morrison who made the most disturbing discovery. Searching through old Army medical records, he found something that made his blood run cold. A detailed description of wound patterns, sketched in his own hand 5 years ago. Wounds that matched exactly the scars he'd seen on the Hermit's body. "Lord help us," he whispered, closing the journal. "I know who he is." The sun was setting over Shadow Creek, painting the canyon walls blood red. In his cabin, the Hermit methodically cleaned his Colts, each movement precise and practiced. The guns felt alien in his hands after so long, yet familiar too, like greeting old friends he'd hoped never to see again. Or maybe old demons he'd known would eventually return. Doc Morrison's hands trembled as he made his way through the darkening streets to Margaret Wheeler's store. The medical journal he carried seemed to burn against his chest, its contents too heavy to bear alone. He found Margaret closing up, the last rays of sunset painting her windows blood red. "You need to see this," he said, laying the journal open on her counter. 5 years ago, I was stationed at Fort Griffin in Texas. We had a patient, a man brought in more dead than alive. 7 bullet wounds, knife cuts, marks of torture. By all rights, he shouldn't have survived." Margaret studied the detailed sketches, her face paling. "These match the Hermit's scars. That man was William Hawke, the most feared lawman in Texas. They called him Silence because he never spoke above a whisper after what the Comancheros did to him. The things he did, hunting them down." Morrison shook his head. "They say he killed 23 men in 8 months, all of them outlaws who'd murdered his wife and child." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying dust and whispered rumors through the streets of Redemption's Cross. At the telegraph office, Marcus Clayton was receiving answers to his inquiries, each response adding pieces to a puzzle he was beginning to wish he'd never started solving. From El Paso, man matching description, believed dead stop lost. Seen pursuing Comanchero gang into Mexico. Stop reported killed in ambush. Stop body never found. Stop. From Austin, William Hawke officially listed as deceased. Stop recommend extreme caution if a live stop, known for exceptional skill with firearms. Stop. From Fort Griffin. If Hawke still living, advise immediate withdrawal. Stop most dangerous man in Texas. Stop. Marcus crumpled the telegrams in his fist, his face tight with concentration. In the saloon, James and Collins were reporting their observations of the Hermit's cabin. Place is rigged, Collins said, nursing a whiskey. Tin cans strung up in the trees, catches the light just right to see anyone coming. Man's got firing. Positions set up too. Covered spots where he can see both approaches to the valley. Regular fort up there, James added. And something else. He knew we were watching, looked right at our hiding spot, like he'd known all along exactly where we'd be. Luke Clayton burst through the saloon doors, his usual cockiness replaced by urgent concern. Marcus, you better come see this. Joe found something up in the rocks near the Hermit's place. They gathered at the edge of town, where Mexican Joe laid out his discovery, 3 sets of bones, bleached white by the desert sun. Found them hidden in a narrow canyon, he explained. Can't be more than a few months old. All got bullet holes in their skulls, real precise-like. Prospectors, maybe, Luke suggested. Fella protecting his gold claim? But Marcus was already piecing it together. 3 months ago, the Murphy gang had disappeared in this area. 3 men never found. Everyone assumed they'd met trouble in Mexico, but now... We're leaving, Marcus announced, his voice flat. First light tomorrow, we ride out. Because of some old lawman, James protested. There's 6 of us, 1 of him. You don't understand. Marcus's voice was tight with controlled fear. I heard stories about Hawke in prison. Man took a bullet in the throat, that's why he whispers. Spent 2 weeks tracking the men who did it. Didn't sleep, didn't rest. Found them one by one. So what? Luke challenged. That was 5 years ago. Man's older now, probably slower. No. Mexican Joe shook his head. You didn't see him move. Ain't nothing slow about him. But before they could argue further, a sound cut through the gathering darkness. Horses approaching from the direction of Shadow Creek. The Hermit rode into town, leading his pack mule, heading toward Margaret Wheeler's store as he did every week for supplies. Marcus Clayton watched him pass, seeing now what he should have noticed before. The way the man seemed to take in everything without obvious movement, the practiced ease with which he carried his concealed weapons, the predatory grace that no amount of time could fully hide. The legend of Silence Hawke was about to be reborn in blood. The atmosphere in Margaret Wheeler's store crackled with tension, as William Hawke, known to the town only as the Hermit, methodically selected his supplies. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, yet his eyes seemed to catch every detail of his surroundings. Through her window, Margaret could see the Clayton gang watching from across the street, their faces tight with barely contained fear and anger. They know who you are, she said quietly, measuring out coffee beans. Doc Morrison recognized your scars. Hawke nodded slightly, his whispered voice carrying easily in the store's silence. Was wondering when that would happen. They're planning to leave tomorrow, she continued, wrapping his purchases. At least that's what Marcus Clayton announced. No, Hawke replied, his eyes briefly meeting hers. They won't. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows down Redemption's Cross's main street. In the saloon, the Clayton gang was dividing into 2 camps. Marcus, Mexican Joe, and Collins argued for leaving, while Luke and James, their pride stung by the idea of running, demanded action. You're all missing the point, Marcus snapped, his patience wearing thin. This isn't about pride or profit anymore. That man out there, he's a ghost, a legend, the kind of man they write dime novels about. Then we'll be famous for killing. Him! Luke countered, the whiskey making him bold. 6 guns against 1, no matter who he is. Collins, who'd survived this long by knowing when to walk away, shook his head. You don't get it, boy. Men like Hawk, they ain't normal. They're more force of nature than human. I heard stories about him down in Texas. Man tracked 7 Comancheros through a sandstorm, found each one before it cleared, left them posed as warnings for others. At the doctor's office, Morrison was sharing more details with young Deputy Ward, who'd returned from patrol to find the town's atmosphere transformed. The fascinating thing about Hawk, Morrison explained, referring to his old journal, was his absolute precision. Every shot, every move calculated. The army wanted to study him, figure out how he did it. But he disappeared after recovering, hunting the men who killed his family. How many did he kill? Ward asked, his voice hushed. Officially, 23. Unofficially, Morrison shrugged. Let's just say a lot of bad men went missing in Texas that year. As night fell, Hawk led his mule back toward Shadow Creek, seemingly unconcerned about the armed men watching his every move. But those who looked closely might have noticed how he used the gathering darkness to his advantage, his form becoming harder to track, blending with the shadows in a way that seemed almost supernatural. James Clayton, drunk and angry, grabbed his gun. To hell with waiting, he declared, standing unsteadily. I'm going to end this now. Marcus caught his arm. You draw that gun, little brother, and it'll be the last thing you ever do. Look out there. He's already gone. Disappeared like smoke. Indeed, the street was empty, though no one had seen exactly when Hawk had vanished from view. Mexican Joe crossed himself again. My grandmother used to tell stories about men like him. Said they made deals with death itself, traded their souls for the power to take life. Superstitious nonsense, Marcus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Collins, you and Joe take first watch. Luke, get your fool brother sobered up. Tomorrow morning, no matter what anyone says, we're riding out. But in the darkness beyond town, William Silence Hawk had already begun his preparations. The guns he'd kept hidden for 3 years now rode in their familiar places, one on his hip, one in a shoulder rig. In his cabin he moved furniture, creating clear lines of fire. Outside, he reset the tripwires and warning signals that had already alerted him to the Clayton gang's earlier surveillance. The night wind carried the sound of coyotes hunting in the distance, their cries like mocking laughter. Tomorrow would bring either peace or violence to Shadow Creek, and William Hawk had long ago stopped believing in peace. The night brought no peace to Redemption's Cross. Collins and Mexican Joe, tasked with keeping watch, swore they saw shadows moving where no shadows should be, heard whispers on the wind that had nothing to do with the desert air. By midnight, their nerves were frayed raw. He's out there, Collins muttered, peering into the darkness from their position on the saloon's roof. Watching us, playing with us like a cat with a mouse. Inside the saloon, James Clayton had finally passed out, his drunken bravado silenced by whiskey and fear. Luke paced restlessly, checking his guns for the 100th time. Marcus sat alone at a corner table, reading through the telegrams again by lamplight, searching for any detail that might help them survive until morning. A new message had arrived at dusk. Hawk, responsible for Reynosa massacre. Stop 18 bandits, found in abandoned church. Stop all killed, without raising alarm. Stop method unknown. Stop. Dawn was still hours away when Deputy Ward, unable to sleep, decided to visit Doc Morrison. He found the doctor organizing his medical supplies with grim determination. Either way, Morrison explained, laying out bandages. Tomorrow will bring casualties. Though if half of what I remember about Hawk is true, they'll need undertakers, more than doctors. What makes him so deadly, Ward asked, helping to roll bandages. I mean, I've seen fast guns before, but the way everyone talks about him. Morrison considered the question carefully. Imagine a man who approaches killing like a scientist approaches an experiment, Methodical, patient, most gunfighters rely on speed and luck. Hawk? He eliminates luck from the equation, plans everything down to the smallest detail. The doctor's hands paused in their work. Did you know he once killed 3 men in a crowded saloon, and half the people there didn't even realize what had happened until the bodies hit the floor? At Shadow Creek, William Hawk moved through the darkness like he'd been born to it. The moon cast enough light for him to check his preparations one final time. He'd spent the past 3 months planning for something like this, though he'd prayed it would never come. The canyon that led to his cabin had become a killing ground. Careful landscaping had created blind spots and choke points. Thin wires, nearly invisible even in daylight, would catch unsuspecting riders. He'd even planted metal fragments in strategic locations. One stray bullet spark could start a fire, turning the dry brush into a wall of flame. Margaret Wheeler couldn't sleep either. She sat by her window, watching the saloon across the street. The lamp in her back room burned low, and in its dim light she wrote in her journal, "Strange how quiet the night is. Like the whole town's holding its breath. Even the drunks and cowboys seem to sense it. Something's coming, something that will be whispered about in saloons across the territory for years to come." Near the edge of town, Tommy Barnes crept out of his house, determined to warn the Hermit, Hawk, he corrected himself, one last time. His father caught him at the stable door. "Son," the elder Barnes said softly, "some things a man's got to face alone. You've done right by him, warning him before. Now stay clear." The first hint of false dawn was still hours away when Luke Clayton made his decision. He couldn't wait, couldn't bear the tension anymore. Strapping on his guns, he headed for the door. "Where you going?" Marcus demanded, though he already knew the answer. "We're gonna end this," Luke replied, his voice tight with fear and determination. "Better than waiting here like rabbits in a trap." "You go out there now, you're dead," Collins warned from his rooftop position. Luke's laugh held no humor. "Way I see it, we're dead anyway. Might as well meet it standing." As he stepped into the street, the wind carried a whisper that might have been his imagination. Poor choice. Luke Clayton's boots echoed against the wooden sidewalk as he made his way through the sleeping town. The moon had set, leaving only starlight to guide his path. Behind him, Marcus watched from the saloon doorway, his face etched with worry. Collins and Mexican Joe tracked Luke's progress from their rooftop position, hands tight on their rifles. "He ain't alone out there," Collins whispered. "I can feel it." The words had barely left his mouth when a shadow detached itself from the darkness beside the general store. Luke froze, his hand hovering over his gun. William Hawk stood 20 paces away, his black duster making him seem part of the night itself. "Turn around, boy," Hawk's whisper carried clearly in the pre-dawn silence. "You've got the wrong end of this fight." Luke's response was to draw, his movement lightning fast, fast enough to have killed lesser men. But Hawk was already moving, his own gun seemingly materializing in his hand. The report of his Colt was deafening in the quiet street. Luke Clayton stopped mid-draw, a look of confusion crossing his face. He looked down at his chest, where a dark stain was spreading. "Didn't even see," he managed before collapsing. "Luke!" Marcus's anguished cry shattered the night. Rifles barked from the rooftop, but Hawk had vanished, leaving only Luke's crumpled form in the dusty street. James Clayton, jolted awake by the gunfire, staggered to the saloon door. His alcohol-fogged brain took a moment to process the scene before him. When understanding hit, his face contorted with rage. "I'll kill you," he screamed into the darkness. "You hear me? I'll kill you." "You had your chance to leave." Hawk's whispered response seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Now we do this my way." Deputy Ward and Doc Morrison rushed from the doctor's office, but Mexican Joe's warning shot kept them back. "Stay out of this," Marcus shouted from the saloon. "This is between us and him." Morrison stood his ground. "That boy needs medical attention." "He's beyond help." Hawk's voice drifted from the shadows. Just like the banker's daughter in Las Cruces. The words hit James Clayton like physical blows. You don't know nothing about that. I know everything. The whisper was closer now, making the outlaws spin frantically, trying to locate its source. Every town you've terrorized, every life you've ruined. I've been following your trail for weeks, waiting. The revelation struck Marcus like a thunderbolt. You knew we were coming, he said, his voice hollow with understanding. Bought that ranch, knowing we'd pass through here eventually. Smart man, Hawk replied. Smarter than your brother. He at least died quick. Collins broke first. Throwing down his rifle, he made a mad dash for the stables. He made it 3 steps before a single shot rang out. The bullet caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling. That was your warning, Hawks. Whisper held a note of finality. Next one won't be. Mexican Joe, his nerves shattered, began praying rapidly in Spanish. James Clayton emptied his revolver into the darkness, each shot illuminating the empty street for a split second. Marcus tried to restrain him, but grief and fear had driven all reason from his mind. "Show yourself!" James screamed, reloading. With trembling hands, "Face me like a man, like you faced that girl's father." The whisper now came from behind the saloon. Or those homesteaders in Mesa Verde. Dawn was still an hour away, but already the eastern sky was lightening almost imperceptibly. In that faint glow, Marcus Clayton could just make out movement on the roof of the livery stable, or thought he could. Every shadow now held potential death. Every whisper of wind might carry the ghost of Painted Rock's final judgment. The night's game of cat and mouse had begun, and only one side knew all the rules. The first light of dawn revealed Luke Clayton's body, still lying in the street, a stark reminder of how quickly death could come. Collins dragged himself behind a water trough, his wounded leg leaving a dark trail in the dust. Mexican Joe remained, frozen on the saloon roof, his rifle trembling in his hands as he scanned the growing light for any sign of movement. Inside the saloon, Marcus Clayton's tactical mind raced through their options, each one worse than the last. James had finally stopped shooting, his gun empty, tears of rage and grief streaming down his face. "He's hunting us," Marcus said quietly, using the town itself as a weapon. As if to confirm his words, a whisper drifted through the pre-dawn. "Here, 5 minutes to get the townspeople clear. After that, everything burns." Margaret Wheeler and Doc Morrison began moving quickly, rousing those few residents who weren't already awake. They knew this was no idle threat. Deputy Ward helped them, keeping well away from the saloon and its desperate occupants. "You're gonna kill innocent people," James shouted, his voice cracking. "That what you call justice? They'll be clear before the fire starts." Hawk's whisper came from a new direction. "Unlike that family in Tucson, the ones that burned in their beds while you robbed their home." Mexican Joe crossed himself again, his eyes wide with terror. "Diablos," he muttered. "He knows everything." "Because he's been following us," Marcus realized aloud. "Every town we hit, he was there after, gathering information, learning our patterns." He laughed bitterly. "We thought we were hunting him, but he's been hunting us all along." The town's evacuation happened with surprising efficiency, people grabbing what they could carry and hurrying toward the church at the edge of town. They'd barely cleared the area when the first fire started, the livery stable erupting in flames that caught the dry wood like tinder. "Jesus," Collins breathed, watching from his position. "He's cutting off our horses." More fires sprang up strategically, not to burn the town, but to channel movement. The saloon remained untouched, but the buildings around it began to smoke and crackle. The morning wind carried burning embers across the street, the heat growing. "Intense." "The back door," Marcus commanded. "We make a run for the alley, try to—" "Already blocked," Hawk's whisper interrupted. "Unlike you, I don't leave things to chance," James Clayton snapped. Grabbing a bottle of whiskey, he smashed it open and began splashing it around. "You want fire?" he screamed. "I'll give you fire. We all burn together." "James, no!" Marcus tried to stop him, but his brother was beyond reason. The match flared in James's hand and vanished along with the top of the matchbox as a single shot split the air. No one had even seen Hawk, just the result of his inhuman accuracy. Mexican. Joe chose that moment to make his break, scrambling down from the roof. He made it farther than Collins had, almost reaching the shadows of the alley before Hawk's voice stopped him. "The children, Joe. Tell me about the children in Las Cruces." Joe froze, his face a mask of terror. I didn't. It wasn't me who... but you watched. You helped, just like always. The shot, when it came, was almost merciful." Joe fell without another word, his body joining Luke's in the blood-stained dust of Redemption's cross. The rising sun painted the smoke, orange and red, turning the street into something out of a fever dream. Marcus Clayton, watching his brother sink deeper into madness, finally understood the true nature of their situation. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution, planned and orchestrated by a man who had turned vengeance into an art form. And the morning was still young. The morning heat, combined with the growing fires, had turned Redemption's cross into an inferno. Collins, still bleeding behind the water trough, watched as flames consumed the livery stable, sending burning debris into the sky. The smoke provided ever-shifting cover, but they all knew Hawk would use that to his advantage, just as he'd used everything else. "Marcus," Collins called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Marcus, for God's sake, let me try to surrender." Inside the saloon, Marcus Clayton ignored the plea, his mind racing through scenarios, each one ending in death. James had retreated behind the bar, muttering to himself, the smell of spilled whiskey still heavy in the air. They were trapped, and everyone knew it. "You know what he's doing, don't you?" Marcus said finally, more to himself than his brother. "Letting us think, letting us remember every person we've wronged, every life we've ruined." "Shut up!" James screamed, covering his ears. "Just shut up!" From somewhere in the smoke-filled street came Hawk's whisper, clear as a church bell, despite the crackling flames. "And tell him, Marcus, tell your brother about El Paso, about the real reason we're here." Marcus's face went ash-white. How could you know about that?" "The woman you killed," Hawk continued, his whisper somehow carrying over the fire's roar. "The one who recognized you from the prison break. She was my wife." The revelation hit like a physical blow. James looked at his brother in confusion, but Marcus remembered. 3 months ago, a chance encounter in an El Paso mercantile. A woman's startled recognition, her attempt to run. A quick knife in a back alley to keep their freedom. She was trying to build a new life. Hawk's voice held centuries of pain. After losing everything at Painted Rock, she'd finally found peace. Then you crossed her path. At the edge of town, the evacuated townspeople listened in horrified fascination as the drama unfolded. Doc Morrison helped tend to those affected by the smoke, but his eyes never left the scene before them. "Man's been planning this for months," he told Deputy Ward. "Bought that ranch knowing they'd eventually pass through, set his trap and waited. Like a spider," Margaret Wheeler added softly. "Patient, methodical. The flames had created a perfect containment zone, hemming the outlaws in while providing Hawk with countless approaches. Collins made another attempt to crawl to safety, but a warning shot kicked up dust inches from his face. "Please," he begged the smoke. "I never killed no women. That wasn't my style." "No," Hawk's whisper came from behind him. "You just helped hide the bodies, counted the money, told yourself you weren't responsible." The shot that followed was precise, surgical. Collins slumped forward, his suffering ended. In the saloon, Marcus Clayton made his decision. "James," he said quietly, "when I give the word, run for the back door. I'll keep him busy." "What?" James looked up, his eyes wild. "No, we stick together. We always stick together." "Little brother," Marcus smiled sadly, "we were dead the moment we rode into town. He's just making us feel it first. Outside the flames rose higher, and Hawk's whisper came again. "Time's running out, Marcus. How do you want to end this?" Marcus checked his gun one last time, then turned to his brother. "Remember that story Pa used to tell about the wolf and the mountain lion?" James nodded, confused by the sudden change of topic. "Sometimes," Marcus continued, "the smartest wolf runs away to fight another day." He stood, moving toward the saloon. "Doors. Now, James, run. Don't look back." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting strange shadows through the smoke as Marcus Clayton stepped into the street to face his fate. Marcus Clayton stood in the smoke-filled street, his gun held loosely at his side. Behind him, he heard James's footsteps retreating toward the back door of the saloon. The morning sun cast strange shadows through the smoke, turning the world into a hellish dreamscape of orange light and dancing darkness. "Facing me yourself," Hawk's whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Noble gesture. Won't save your brother, though." "Maybe not," Marcus replied, turning slowly, trying to locate the source of the voice. "But he's young, stupid. Everything that happened, El Paso, Las Cruces, all of it, that was my doing, my orders." "Not quite everything." Hawk's voice shifted. "Position. He made his own choices, like with that girl in Tucson. From their vantage point near the church, the townspeople watched the scene unfold like some terrible piece of theater. Deputy Ward raised his rifle, thinking to help, but Doc Morrison pushed it down. "Don't," the doctor warned. "This is justice, not law." At the back of the saloon, James Clayton burst through the door into the smoke-filled alley. His brothers. Sacrifice had bought him a chance, and blind panic drove him forward. He made it 3 steps before a whisper froze him in place. "Going somewhere, boy?" James spun, firing blindly into the smoke. His shots went wide, striking wooden walls and empty air. When the whisper came again, it was behind him. "Your brothers. Trying to buy your life with his," Hawk said softly. "Thing is, he doesn't have that right. Not after what you did to those children." In the street, Marcus heard his brother's shots and closed his eyes in pain. "Just make it quick," he said. "To the smoke. That's all I ask. Quick?" Hawk's whisper held a note of cold amusement. "Like you made it quick for my Sarah. She recognized you in El Paso, didn't she? Just wanted to buy some cloth. Then she saw your face, remembered you from the trial." Marcus's gun hand began to tremble. "I didn't know she was your wife. It was just cleaning up loose ends." "Loose ends." The whisper hardened. "She was building a new life after Painted Rock, after losing everything. She'd finally found peace, and you butchered her in an alley over something that happened years ago." In the back alley, James Clayton was coming apart. Every shadow seemed to move. Every whisper of wind could be death approaching. He fired again, his shots becoming more erratic. "Stop it!" he screamed. "Stop playing with us!" "Playing?" Hawk's voice came from above. "This isn't a game. This is a reckoning." A single shot rang out, and James's gun went spinning from his hand, along with 2 of his fingers. His scream of pain cut through the morning air. Marcus tried to run toward the sound, but stopped as Hawk's whisper came from directly behind him. "Your brother or your revenge, Marcus. Choose." Time seemed to freeze as Marcus Clayton faced his final decision. In that moment, he saw everything clearly, every wrong choice, every evil deed that had led him here. The smoke parted briefly, and for just a second, he caught a glimpse of Hawk standing in the street, those cold eyes fixed on him with the patience of a guillotine blade. "James," Marcus called out, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, little brother. I led you down this road. This is where it ends." He turned, raising his gun with all the speed that had made him famous from Texas to the territories. But Hawk was faster, had always been faster. The shot echoed through the burning street, like the period at the end of a long, dark sentence. Marcus Clayton looked surprised, almost thoughtful, as he fell face first into the dust of Redemption's cross. James Clayton staggered back into the burning street, cradling his mutilated hand, his face a mask of pain and terror. His brother's body lay in the dust ahead of him, another marker in the trail of death that had followed them to Redemption's cross. The fires around them had begun to die down, leaving a hellish landscape of smoldering timber and thick smoke. "You know what I've been thinking about, James?" Hawk's whisper drifted through the smoke like a ghost's caress. "That family in Tucson, the ones you tortured for their safe combination." "No," James moaned, stumbling backward. "No more. Just kill me and be done." "Their little girl was only 8, the whisper continued, relentless as conscience. "She begged you to stop hurting her father. What was it you said to her?" "Please," James's voice cracked with desperation. "You told her that monsters were real, that she should have listened to her parents and been a good girl." Hawk's voice hardened. "You were right about one thing. Monsters are real." At the church, the townspeople listened in horrified fascination as justice unfolded before them. Margaret Wheeler found herself remembering every interaction with the quiet hermit who'd visited her store, seeing now how he'd positioned himself, waiting for this moment. "Man's not just killing them," Doc Morrison observed quietly. "He's making them face what they've done, making them feel the weight of it before they die." Deputy Ward swallowed hard. "Never heard of anyone hunting like this. It's like being stalked by your own sins," Morrison finished. In the street, James Clayton made a desperate dash for his brother's fallen gun. His fingers had just brushed the grip when a shot kicked up dust inches from his hand. He jerked back with a cry of pain and fear. "Your brother died quick," Hawk's whisper came from a new direction. "Professional courtesy, one killer to another. But you, James, you like to take your time with victims, made them suffer." Through the smoke, James caught glimpses of movement, a shadow here, a flicker there. Each time he turned, Hawk was somewhere else, invisible yet omnipresent. The morning sun cast multiple shadows through the smoke, making it impossible to tell which might hide death. "You want to know something interesting?" Hawk continued, his voice moving again. "I've been following your gang for 3 months, learned everything about you. Your habits, your preferences, the way you like to work." A horrible realization dawned on James's face. "The ranch, you bought it knowing you'd come this way eventually. Yes, knowing you couldn't resist terrorizing a lone hermit." Of course, there was a cold satisfaction in the whisper now. "I chose this town, this spot, this moment, been preparing it for you." James spun wildly, firing his remaining bullets at shadows with his good hand. Each shot was answered only by echoes and Hawk's whispering voice, moving like smoke on the wind. "Your brother tried to protect you at the end," Hawk observed. "Tried to give his life for yours. But we both know you wouldn't have done the same for him, just like you didn't protect that little girl." "I'll tell you everything," James screamed into the smoke. "Names, places, buried money, whatever you want to know." "I don't need information, James." The whisper was closer now, almost intimate. "I need you to understand something before you die, something important." "What's that?" "That girl in Tucson was right to believe in monsters, but she should have known," Hawk's voice hardened to steel, "that sometimes monsters hunt other monsters." The smoke parted briefly, and for the first time, James Clayton saw William Hawk clearly, standing in the street like an avenging angel, his cold eyes promising an overdue reckoning. In that moment, James knew with terrible certainty that all his sins had finally caught up with him. Time seemed to stop in that smoke-filled street as James Clayton faced William Hawk. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away some of the haze to reveal the full tableau of justice being served. Luke's body lay where he'd fallen, a warning. Unheeded, Marcus sprawled face down in the dust, his last attempt at redemption bought with blood. Collins and Mexican Joe had died as they lived, running from their sins. "You know what the worst part is, James?" Hawk's whisper carried clearly. "Now, no longer needing to hide. You actually believed you'd get away with it all, that there wouldn't be consequences. James's eyes darted frantically between Hawk and his brother's fallen gun, still lying tantalizingly out of reach. His mangled hand throbbed with each heartbeat, a reminder of how hopeless any resistance would be. The girl, Hawk continued, taking a measured step forward. The one in Tucson. She survived, you know. Lives with her aunt now. Hasn't spoken a word since that night, but she drew pictures of what happened, drew your face over and over. I was drunk, James stammered, backing away. The others, they pushed me to it. Marcus said, Marcus is dead. Hawk cut him off. Collins is dead. They all paid their price. Now it's your turn to face what you've done. At the church, the townspeople watched in silence as the final act of this terrible drama unfolded. Deputy Ward found himself gripping his rifle so tight his knuckles had gone white. Should we do something? He whispered to Doc Morrison. The doctor shook his head. This isn't about the law anymore, son. This is older justice, the kind that follows men like James Clayton across desert and mountain until accounts are settled. Margaret Wheeler noticed something nobody else had. The way Hawk was herding James step by step toward a specific spot in the street. Even now, even in this final moment, the man was executing a carefully laid plan. James Clayton made one last attempt at mercy. I've got money hidden, lots of it. From the bank in Santa Fe, you could... The money you took from the Peterson family. Hawk's cold voice stopped him cold. After you murdered their father in front of them. That money? How? James's face went ashen. How do you know all this? Because I was there. After each raid, each murder, following your trail, gathering evidence, learning everything about you. Hawk took another step forward. 3 months of planning, James, all leading to this moment. James looked around wildly, seeing for the first time how the positioning of the burning buildings had created a perfect trap. No escape routes, no hiding places, just him and the whispered voice of judgment. The girl in Tucson, Hawk said softly. She asked God to send someone to punish the monsters, asked him every night in her silence. His gun glinted in the morning. Son, God was listening. In desperation, James lunged for his brother's fallen gun. His fingers had just closed around the grip when Hawk's voice stopped him again. Your brother's gun is empty, James. Has been since his last shot. You really think I'd leave a loaded weapon within reach? The truth of it hit James like a physical blow. Even this, his final desperate grab for survival, had been anticipated and planned for. Every move, every choice had been orchestrated by the man standing before him. Please, he whispered, all pretense of bravery gone. Please, I don't want to die. Hawk's response held all the mercy of a desert storm. Neither did that little girl's father. Neither did my wife. Neither did any of the innocent people you tortured and killed. He raised his Colt with mechanical precision. The time for mercy is long past. The morning sun broke fully through the smoke then, illuminating the street like God's own spotlight. James Clayton, the last of the brutal gang that had terrorized 3 territories, stood trembling in its glare, about to face the consequence of every evil deed he'd ever committed. Shot, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A single report echoing through the smoke-filled street of Redemption's Cross. James Clayton looked almost surprised as he fell, his body joining his brother's in the blood-stained dust. The last of the Clayton gang had met his judgment, and the morning wasn't yet half done. William Hawk stood motionless for a long moment, his gun still raised, watching as the smoke from its barrel drifted away on the desert breeze. 3 months of planning, of waiting, of carefully laying his trap, had come to this inevitable conclusion. The ghosts of those he'd sworn to avenge, his wife Sarah, the families in Tucson and Las Cruces, all the innocent victims of the Clayton gang's brutality, seemed to whisper on the wind before finally finding peace. Doc Morrison was the first to approach, his medical bag in hand, though he knew his services wouldn't be needed. He found Hawk methodically checking each body, ensuring his work was complete. "You'll be moving on, I expect," the doctor said quietly. It wasn't really a question. By nightfall, Hawk's whisper carried its familiar rasp. "Best if the law doesn't have to make any difficult decisions." Deputy Ward, following behind Morrison, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, for what it's worth, no one here saw anything worth reporting. Way we figure it, the Clayton gang had a falling out, killed each other in the confusion." Margaret Wheeler approached next, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "Supplies," she explained, "for your journey. And—" She hesitated, then continued, "There's a little girl in Tucson. If you pass that way, I'll make sure she knows." Hawk nodded slightly. "The monsters won't hurt anyone else." The townspeople began emerging from their shelter, moving cautiously through the smoldering ruins of their street. Already, buckets were being passed to deal with the remaining fires. Life would go on, but Redemption's Cross would never forget. This morning, Tommy Barnes helped his father hitch up their wagon. They'd offered to take the bodies out for burial, though none present thought the Clayton gang deserved such consideration. "You knew, didn't you?" Tommy asked the man he'd known as the Hermit. "When I warned you about them asking questions, you were already prepared." "You're a good boy, Tommy," Hawk replied softly. "Keep that heart of yours. The world needs more like you." By noon, William Hawk had mounted his horse, the same quiet animal that had carried him into town months ago. The townspeople watched him go, this legend who had lived among them in silence, waiting for justice's appointed hour. Sheriff Hawley, returning from his futile quest for help, would find a changed town and a story that would be whispered about in saloons across the territory. The tale of how a quiet hermit turned out to be the most lethal manhunter in the West, of how he'd laid a trap months in the making, of how the Clayton gang had finally met the one predator they couldn't escape. Some say William Silence Hawk continued his solitary wandering, moving like a ghost through the territories, appearing whenever evil men needed to be reminded that consequences eventually find everyone. Others claim he finally found his peace, settling somewhere far from the memories of blood and smoke. But in Redemption's Cross, they tell a different story. They speak of how justice sometimes wears a black duster and carries matched colts. How vengeance can be patient, methodical, waiting months or years to strike. And most importantly, they talk about the morning they learned why some quiet men are best left to their solitude. For in the end, the most dangerous predators are the ones you never hear coming, and the deadliest judgments are delivered in a whisper. Want to hear another legendary tale of the Old West? Click one of these stories on your screen, and don't forget to subscribe to catch our next upload. Some say it might be even more chilling than this one.